I actually want to start by thanking Andrew Nolan for introducing us to the concept of the 6 C's, or the 7 C's if you're more of a pirate fan, because it's a logical place for me to jump off, and I appreciate that segue. I want to take that a little bit further even by using a concrete example of how important these new skills are. I want to take you back to the year 2005, August. And in 2005, a storm developed in the Western Caribbean and moved westwards across Florida and hit the Gulf of Mexico. And when it hit the Gulf of Mexico, it turned north and slowly picked up strength. And by the time it hit the Louisiana and Mississippi coasts, it was called Hurricane Katrina. And Hurricane Katrina hit with devastating effect. 250,000 homes were lost. Winds were up to 280 kilometers per hour. It was a truly devastating storm in all regards. And the reason I bring up Katrina isn't so much because it was a natural disaster unlike any others. Certainly we've had more disastrous earthquakes, tsunamis, and other hurricanes. But in a lot of ways, Hurricane Katrina was an unnatural disaster. And it was an unnatural disaster because of the fallout of leadership afterwards. I think a lot of people in this room, and indeed across the world, didn't know what FEMA was before Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of people know it now, unfortunately. When we take a look at Hurricane Katrina, and we consider the things that didn't happen in the response after the storm hit, we have a complete and utter lack of collaboration between the City of New Orleans, state, and federal agencies, which unfortunately led to some horrific conditions. We had a complete lack of creative thinking to go beyond the bureaucracy and the red tape and not to allow other agencies that could be involved to get involved. We had a complete absence of critical thinking, which enabled people to problem solve once FEMA completely proved to be inadequate up to the scenario. And all of these skills come together with communication, a lack of communication both before the storm and after the storm about what people could do to get out of this horrendous situation. Some response times were up to 9 days. People were stranded on top of roofs, and we take a look at what a fundamental failure that those skills led to, or lack of skills led to. Now, it's important to note that communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking aren't new skills, but there's a widespread push now in the literature, and indeed by my fellow speakers here today, to talk about them now and building them into the curriculum. Now, unlike technology or brand new learning spaces, all of which kids deserve now, they deserve iPads in the class and desktops, the problem with technology and with new buildings is that it requires somebody else to put them in the room before you can use them. The beauty of collaboration and creativity, the so-called C skills, which are often labeled 21st century skills, although they've been around forever and have been important forever, the beauty of them is it can be taught now. If you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle and you're going to go talk to a child after TEDx today, you can start working on these things now. If you're a teacher and you're going to be educating somebody else's child tomorrow, that's the best time to start. Okay? We look at how awful it is when we take a look at a hurricane response and you see what's happening when those skills are lacking. But it's time to start doing it now. Right? When we take a look at those skills and we look past the technology and we look just at the skills that we require to move forward, it becomes almost a moral imperative to build them into the curriculum today. And I don't want to talk about the excuses or the barriers that exist, because I believe we can pull the future in now. It doesn't require money. It just requires a commitment from educators to make these important today. Now, if you're a parent, or you're an aunt or an uncle, or you interact with children in any way, or you're an educator, of course, but I want to talk to the parents for a second, because you have the ability to go home today and start talking to your children about these things. Using words brings life to ideas. And so if your 3-year-old is playing nicely with your 5-year-old, call it cooperation. Cooperation is the beginning of collaboration. If your 7-year-old turns a paper towel roll into a pirate's periscope, or turns it into a musical instrument, reward that creativity. Say, that's fantastic, it's creative. Start using the words to build their vocabulary, and they'll start seeing themselves as creative, and they'll start seeing themselves as collaborators. If you are a teacher, we get some students sitting in the front, and we've had a fantastic opening talk by our student talking about standardized testing. And of course, because we pay attention to standardized testing, kids pay attention to it. Well, what if we start paying attention to critical thinking and collaboration, and we start assessing it? Can you imagine that? Kids have a funny way of paying attention to the things we assess, because right now, they rely on grades in order to get to university and get great jobs and things like that. So if you are an educator, start building it in now. And I don't want to hear about how we can't do that because the curriculum is packed with standards and we have to get all this content through and there's projects and there's PSATs to study for. Because that's an excuse. It costs nothing to start talking to children today. You're starting a science project tomorrow with a group of high school students, and you talk about we need this content and these skills and this in your presentation, and then take 15 seconds to talk to the children in your class about what will it look like if your group is collaborating. 15 seconds is all it takes. Then, of course, ask them the flip side of that question. What will it look like if you're not collaborating? A lot of the times the kids know the answer to that already because that's what happens on a daily basis a lot of the time, all right? But those 15 seconds that it takes to frame one of those so-called 21st century skills is a great way to segue into making that vocabulary part of their everyday experience, all right? If you don't agree with me that we have to pull it into today, although I think you will, and I see this as a moral imperative, all we have to do is take a look at what happens when those things aren't in place, and we'll get there in a second. But we used to think that kids were naturally more creative. Certainly I wasn't one of them, but I didn't have a teacher who was teaching me 21st century skills, all right? So we used to think that kids were naturally more creative, more artistic. And we certainly have known children that were more naturally great public speakers, and I might have put myself in that group before in the run-up for TED, but this has made me all nervous, and I'll overcome that. But we would no more accept the premise that a child that took to reading easily was a natural in reading, that we wouldn't teach anybody else who wasn't a natural, then we should accept the premise that that child is more creative, and so they will be creative and we won't push them along. We don't have tons of readers out there that can read because people didn't believe in them. We believed it was important. And we need to be the same. We need to do the same things to believe that critical thinking, communication, collaboration, and creativity are equally important. Because if you think about the moral imperative, we take a look at another concrete example of when those skills are in place. And we take a look, instead of going back 8 years to Hurricane Katrina, where the response was marred by political infighting, or in a lack of collaboration, or an inability to get past the bureaucracy, you go back a month ago to another storm that hit the United States, this time in the Northeast. Superstorm Sandy was perhaps the most, I don't know if celebrated is the right word, but the most celebrated media storm in history. There were more stories run about Superstorm Sandy in the run-up to Sandy to be openly communicative about the fact that the storm was coming. There were more stories on the news about that than any other storm in history. Great communication. You had great collaboration between a Republican governor in New Jersey and a Democratic president who was going for re-election, overcoming party boundaries to do what was right and collaborate and work together at the state and federal level. You had great creativity. You have a president, Obama is quoted as saying, cut through the red tape, see past the bureaucracy, all right? Find solutions. Tied, of course, to critical thinking. Find solutions where solutions do not exist. Now, the response to Sandy wasn't perfect, and Long Island still doesn't have the lights on for some reason, but I'll leave that to people who are working in the States to figure out. But when you take a look at the death toll between when those 21st century skills were in place and not in place, it becomes shocking. When you take a look at Superstorm Sandy, which was in some ways it was a larger storm. It was twice as big. It hit a larger population center in New York and New Jersey. It met a cold front where sleet and hail and freezing temperatures complicated the issue. In Superstorm Sandy, there were 110 lives lost. 110. Now, any loss of life is not acceptable, but natural disasters will happen. When you look at Hurricane Katrina, the total was 1,836. 110, 1,836. It's not the naturalness of the disaster that made Katrina a worldwide fiasco. It was the unnaturalness of it because of the lack of 21st century skills that were in place by the leaders at that time. And my call to you as parents in the room, aunts, uncles, anybody that interacts with children, and certainly the educators, is that in a world moving forward that will become increasingly complex as we become more and more interwoven and issues of global warming and technology issues move forward, is we want to make sure that there's more people who are graduating from school who are going to treat every storm like it was Superstorm Sandy and not Hurricane Katrina. Thank you very much.